Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Timothy Puko of the Washington Post and Dr. Raj Shah of the Rockefeller Foundation.
Raj, thanks so much for taking the time to do this. I think you're all aware that the title of our little talk here is Big Bets, and there are a couple reasons for that. But if you don't mind, I'm going to make you wait just a little bit. Please stick around to the end for the second one. The first, I think, has a lot to do with what's going on at the Rockefeller Foundation, right? Can you just tell us about the big bet that you're making there?
Yeah, Tim, well, it's great to be with you. It's great to be with the Concordia community here and online. You all are change makers that we admire and get to partner with, so thank you for your leadership. Our big bet at the Rockefeller Foundation is that the climate transition can be inclusive of everyone and that we can come together as a global community to change the way we're fighting climate change. So we're committing $1 billion over the next 5 years to that task. We're doing it in three major areas. The first is motivating world leaders and activists to aim higher, to be more ambitious. As you know, the UN global stocktake is going to estimate that we're going to be somewhere between 2.5 and 3 degrees warming as opposed to 1.5 degrees, and that's actually a catastrophic level of climate change that's already in train. So we have to change the level of ambition. The second part of our commitment is to use our $1 billion really as philanthropic risk capital so that we're investing in the types of efforts that can attract private investment, get the kind of leverage we want, and so whether it's helping draw down the Inflation Reduction Act funds in Birmingham, Alabama to create green jobs and battery manufacturing, or whether it's rolling out renewable energy in Eastern Congo, which we just announced with a set of partners, we're able to use our resources to make technology available. And the final part of our big bet is to walk the talk. And so we are committing to a net zero pledge for the foundation itself in its own operations by 2050, and we are committing to improve the way we manage our endowment to be more climate forward as well.
So does that mean that we should think of the Rockefeller Foundation with all of its historic ties to oil money as primarily a climate organization now?
I hope so, yes, because look, at the end of the day, every climate change is the existential threat to our planet. And even more so, we're a foundation that, as you make reference to, was founded on John D. Rockefeller Sr.'s extreme oil fortune, right? And that was 110 years ago. But the basic idea was we should invest in those areas of what they called scientific philanthropy, where we could bring the frontiers of technology and innovation to everyone to lift people up. And we invested in medicine and kind of created the field of modern international public health. We've invested in agriculture and led a green revolution that moved 1 billion people off the brink of hunger and poverty. And now we're investing in the climate transition and specifically the renewable energy technologies that are really our best hope to both address poverty at scale and to fight climate change in a way that changes the trajectory.
Now, I think we've got a lot of people here who are interested in institutions, especially big institutions in government, and this isn't the changes that you're making right now at Rockefeller. That's not the first time that you've had to see a fundamental overhaul of how a big institution operates, right? So can you tell us a little bit about your time in government, and I think most of all, what you learned from that time that you can use now in helping not just Rockefeller, but I think big institutions broadly get urgent about addressing the climate change issue?
Sure. When I was in government, I served as President Obama's administrator for the U.S. Agency for International Development. And actually, the first week on the job, there was a devastating earthquake in Haiti that almost immediately led to nearly 250,000 people perishing in what I consider, one of the most, if not the most horrific humanitarian catastrophes ever. And what I saw in that moment, when I was asked to lead that response on behalf of our country, was just how much people across the agency, across the government, across the US military, and frankly across the community of public and private partners, many of whom are here today, wanted to be part of the solution. And it taught me that frankly, when you're confronting a crisis, there are a lot of good people out there that are willing to go the extra mile. They're willing to change the way they do their work. They're willing to change the way they communicate and work with partners, and they're willing to put in the hours and spend the resources to make a difference. And I've just seen that time and again. At Rockefeller, a few years ago, we pivoted pretty aggressively to focus on fighting COVID when that tragedy unfolded. And now, going forward, we're shifting the way we work. In the last 5 years, about 25% of our commitments were firmly about fighting climate change. In the next 5 years, it'll be more than 75%. And so I admire those of you in this room and those of you online and those in my team that show that willingness to be agile and creative to address the challenges of our time, because those challenges are in fact moving, and they're moving fast, and we have to act now.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you mentioned COVID in particular, because I think if you listen to political leaders or probably even the public, quite frankly, one of the fundamental features of our time, and tell me if I'm wrong, is that we're so frequently facing overlapping crises. And so much of what government and other institutions, change makers, are having to deal with is balancing some set of priorities against another. And to bring this back to climate change, we have seen, I cover energy and climate for those of you who don't know, and so much of my coverage in the past, what has it been, a year and a half now? Since the Russian invasion of Ukraine has been about how crazy energy markets have been, spikes in energy costs for consumers, political unrest around that. There's been a lot of retrenchment from governments, especially in the West, on, I think, climate. Again, tell me if I'm wrong. Because they're so worried about energy security. So I do want to hear from you, just like how much of a setback do you think it's been for our governments, our financial institutions, just maybe even the foundation community, in fighting emissions, addressing climate change when we have this energy security crisis as well?
Yeah, well, first of all, your reporting is really valuable for the world, so thank you for taking it on.
That's kind of you to say. I don't know if that's true. I don't know if that's
well,
true.
we need more climate reporting. And I would say, if you look big picture, the United States, the EU, China have all made big transformational investments in the trillions of dollars in greening the structure of their economies. And the Ukraine war absolutely is a setback. I think the example that European nations are being forced to set by reverting to expanded fossil fuel utilization undermines the message that the G7 and others are communicating to the Vietnams, Indonesias, Indias, Brazils of the world, and saying, hey, don't use coal to fuel your growth, use renewables, but we're going to go back and protect our energy security first. And what it highlights is the need to build bridges across the globally more advanced economies and the globally emerging economies. And that's why we think we can play a big role in the climate fight going forward. In fact, if you look at, if we there's about 3.5 billion people in 81 countries that consume well under the 1,000 kilowatt hours per capita per year modern energy minimum. In America, we consume 12 times that level. In Europe, it's 8 to 10 times that level. If those 3.5 billion people grow their energy consumption using fossil fuels and coal, 75% of all emissions in 2050 will come from those 81 lower income countries, and the climate fight will be over and we will have lost dramatically. So taking seriously the idea that the renewable energy revolution needs to be for everyone and not just for wealthy countries that are pouring massive trillions of dollars of subsidies in is a big part of why we're making this commitment. It's a big part of what we're doing going forward.
Just give us a status update. Is that the path that we're on right now? If you had to bet, would you say that the developing world that you're talking about is more likely to go that direction with fossil fuels and higher emissions than it is to go to clean energy?
Yeah, right now we're not on that path. I mean, next year you're going to have more coal than you have this year rolling out in these countries. Next year you're going to have more fossil fuel utilization than you have this year. And if you look at the broad history of renewable energy deployment, less than 1% of all renewable energy globally deployed in its history has been in Africa, the continent that's that's lowest on energy consumption and fastest on future energy consumption growth. So something has to change. I mean, if you're buying batteries or stationary storage in developing economies, you both don't have access to supply chains, and when you have access, you pay as much as 3.5 times what a utility would pay in the United States. if you want access to solar panels, access to all the basic technologies that constitute this revolution. This is why we set up the Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet. It's why we're working in 24 countries already to reach millions of people and support developers to come together with tools like aggregated procurement and subsidized investment in order to change that equation. But it's not just going to happen on its own. Private investment alone is not going to go march into Indonesia and Vietnam and decommission coal plants and build out renewable energy. This has to be a big global project that we take on together, and we take on with the seriousness of World War II, of a Ukraine war, of the Marshall Plan when we helped rebuild Western Europe, because it's in our core strategic interest. This is actually not just in our core strategic interest, it's our interest to survive, and it's absolutely essential to get this done.
Well, help me to understand this a little bit more, because I think you hear so frequently that the costs of solar, wind, batteries have all come down. That's definitely true, but from the way you say it, it sounds like maybe that's not the case in developing countries?
Yeah, so 40 to 50 developing countries right now are either in or teetering on a debt crisis. I was just in Kenya, 62 cents out of the public dollar is repaying interest. In Ghana, it's 75 cents out of the public dollar. So there's no real fiscal headroom to invest in greening their economy. Where the green economy is exploding, rightly, is in wealthy nations like the United States that are now largely subsidizing the transition to a green economy. If you do not subsidize the transition to a green economy in lower income countries, it simply won't happen. And so you have to construct those subsidies in a way that's public-private, that's thoughtful, that allows for accelerated access to technology, and that recognizes that, frankly, I've been to communities where a poor salt worker who is literally pulling, a massive rake in a hot, sunny salt flat is depending on a diesel pump to pull the water up and create the bed of water that is her livelihood, and spending all her money on that diesel pump. Once she replaced that diesel pump with a solar pump, she's earning 3 times what she was before, sending her kids to school for the first time, and those kids are talking about going to college instead of living in poverty for generations. We have to understand that the renewable energy technology revolution is not just for kids driving Teslas to, GameStop in the United States or elsewhere. It is really the path forward for unlocking real human progress in many, many parts of the world that today are systematically deprived from that access.
They are still growing, though, at least in their energy consumption. Is it easier for our banks or financial institutions, our giant like energy companies, to fund fossil fuel projects still in a lot of these countries?
Oh, absolutely. In
Even
fact,
more than renewables?
Sure. There are hundreds of billions of dollars of fossil fuel subsidies that support the existing infrastructure. So, yeah, it's absolutely, not only is it more feasible, the grid systems in many of these countries are not set up to take renewables on at scale, which is why we're helping them improve grid management, put better software on the system, and invest in battery storage, so the next wave of electrification can even be renewable. If you look at Kenya, for example, one of the largest wind farms in Africa is sitting largely underutilized because they just don't have the capacity to take intermittent power, and instead they're using heavy fuel oil peaking and other ways to manage their grid. So, we have a choice to make as a planet. Either the climate transition is only for wealthy economies, or it's for everyone. I think for the UN General Assembly this week to be successful, we have to get beyond this North versus South debate about loss and damage and resources, and it's all private investment that will solve your problems. And we have to come together and say, what does it actually take to transition the global economy everywhere to a green development pathway, and we have to make the investments that make that real.
Now, we don't have a lot of time left, and I promised everybody that they would get to hear the second reason that this is entitled Big Bets. I think you've got a book coming, is that right, or what's going on?
I do. October 10th, a book that I wrote called Big Bets, How Large-Scale Change Really Happens, comes out. And it's a book I wanted to write because I feel like I got a chance early in my career to work with Bill and Melinda Gates when they said, let's try to immunize every child on the planet. Later in my career, I've helped fight 2 pandemics, Ebola in West Africa and COVID in the United States and around the world. And now we're embarked on this effort to reach 1 billion people in emerging economies with renewable energy. so they can lift themselves out of energy poverty. And I am convinced that when we take on these big projects, too often our ambition is just not high enough, and our vision for what's possible is too limited. So I wrote the book Big Bets so that more people can embrace this way of bringing together public and private partners to solve some of the biggest challenges in the world. It's how we try to work at the Rockefeller Foundation. It's why we're making $1 billion commitment, our next big bet on climate change. And I hope it can define how we raise our ambition to make the world more just and more sustainable for everybody.
You'll have to come back next year and tell us how the book went.
Okay, if you'll have me.
Yeah, thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you. Thanks, Tim. Great, thank you.
Yeah.